Woke London is the most anti-Semitic city in the West, according to an Israeli minister. Amichai Chikli, a politician in Israel who is in charge of diaspora affairs for Israel, says a combination of the radical left and radical Islam has meant Jews no longer feel safe in the capital. His sentiments are echoed by polling from the National Jewish Assembly, with almost half of respondents concluding there is no long-term future for Jewish people in the United Kingdom. Joining me now is Lance Forman, a former MEP and businessman. Lance, welcome to the Independent Republican, Mike Graham.
Always a pleasure, Mike.
Always good to see you. This is an extraordinary situation, and I can't even believe we're sitting here about to discuss what I've just said, that London has become a difficult and possibly dangerous place for Jewish people to live.
It is very difficult, and it is a conversation that Jewish people right across London are having every single day. You know, I might be fine, but is this going to be a place for my children, my grandchildren? And I'll tell you why we think that and what goes through our head.
Yeah.
You know, this is very personal to me. My dad was a Holocaust survivor.
Yeah.
He lost more than half his family in Auschwitz, just murdered because they were Jewish for no other reason. And the question that a lot of Jewish people ask, having learnt from history, is that when things were getting bad in Germany, they felt they were so sort of ingrained in German society that, oh, nothing's going to happen to them.
Right.
And then a few shops got firebombed, and, you know, Jewish kids weren't allowed to go to universities, and there were boycotts against Jews. And they all said it's not going to happen to them, and then it did. And they left it too late to leave.
Right.
He was one of the lucky ones, got out early, but they left it too late. And as a result, 6 million Jews across Europe, a third of the entire global Jewish population, was wiped out. So every Jewish person, not only in London, in every city across Europe, is all thinking, this looks like history repeating itself. Is there a future for us, or should we leave? And if so, where do we go? Should we go to Israel or, you know, anywhere else?
And Israel is obviously a difficult place to live, presumably at the moment as well, because the rocket attacks continue. The threat, as Melanie Phillips, I thought, very eloquently put on Question Time last week, the threat is there that Hamas will come back. They've said they will. They're not interested in peace. They're not interested in a two-state solution. They're not interested in anything but the wiping out of Israel as a nation and the wiping out of Jewish people.
That's right. I have a son that lives in Jerusalem, and I'll tell you what, he thinks that he's safer there with the rockets than we are in London. I mean, that is really quite extraordinary, and that's a feeling that a lot of Jewish people have. They just sort of feel safer, you know, all together in Israel, fighting their fight, and, you know, hoping that their allies will stick, you know, strongly with them. But at the moment, you know, it's the support is waning.
Well, this is the trouble, isn't it? Because we heard very sort of early on, I suppose, in November, perhaps, that, you know, is Hamas winning the war of public relations, which at the time, you know, I was kind of very dismissive of. I was like, well, of course they're not. You know, these are horrific, ghastly terrorists. How could they possibly be winning a war of public relations against a democratic nation? But they are.
The problem is there is a lot of deep-seated anti-Semitism, and as you said at the start, you know, it comes both from Islamism within the UK and also from the left. I mean, you're probably familiar with the journalist, broadcaster Mehdi Hassan.
Yes.
He wrote a piece in the New Statesman a number of years ago.
He got kicked out of his show in America, didn't he?
He did. He's back here in the UK, and I think he's doing work with The Guardian. But he wrote a piece in the New Statesman a few years ago, and these are his words, not mine.
Yeah.
He said that anti-Semitism in the Muslim community, the Muslim British community, is, his words, our dirty little secret. Now, it's not a secret anymore. You know, the night of October the 7th, so before Israel, you know, Israel took 3 weeks to respond. They had to work out, you know, what are we going to do following this tragedy, you know, the greatest, you know, murder of Jews since the Holocaust. That very night, there were thousands of people protesting in London against the Israeli embassy, cheering and celebrating the massacre in Israel.
And they've been doing it for the last 24 weeks.
Well, they have. I mean, very early on, you know, there were posters of, you know, the hostages, young, you know, kids.
I remember.
Older women, posters going up saying, we've got to get our hostages out. And people were tearing those posters down before Israel had started, you know, its defensive war to try and remove Hamas. So, you know, you have it within, you know, not across the entire Muslim community, of course not.
No.
But it is there within certain aspects of the Islamic community in the UK. And also on the left. And also, I'll tell you what, Mike, one of the biggest, I think, one of the biggest instigators of this, and it's not just in recent years, this has been going for a long time, is the BBC.
Yes. Well, I was going to get on to the BBC because, of course, this very week, a Tory MP has called for the suspension of those two BBC Arabic journalists who were celebrating as well on October the 7th, you know, liking tweets about, you know, this is the beginning of the uprising against Israel, you know, liking tweets about Hamas being freedom fighters and all this kind of thing. And it looks as though there's been something like 130 apologies. Is that right?
There have been 130 corrections.
Corrections.
Over over 2 a week.
Yeah.
You know, the BBC is consistently getting it wrong, and you have to ask why. There is, in my view, there is institutional anti-Semitism within the BBC, and I'll tell you why this is so important.
Yeah.
It's because the BBC are widely regarded globally as the sort of gold standard of journalism.
Right.
Now, if they can be anti-Semitic and demonise Israel and delegitimise Israel, which they've been doing for decades now, it empowers every other media organisation across the world to do the same thing. And here's an interesting thing. BBC has a channel, BBC Arabic.
Yes.
It has 40 million viewers, listeners and viewers. Now, BBC Arabic is never going to be pro-Israel.
Right.
At best, it'll be neutral, but of course it's not going to be neutral either because of its audience.
Yeah.
BBC Arabic's funded by the licence fee payer.
Yeah.
Why should I be paying for the sort of absolute junk
for propaganda
and bias that it's just churning out week after week? Even if the BBC in the UK is, you know, we can complain about that too, you know, not calling Hamas terrorists. Well, they did that for weeks.
Well, they still don't call them terrorists. They now just say that they're prescribed as a terrorist group by the government.
It's outrageous.
They still don't call them terrorists. And the other thing that I found astonishing, and I mention it as often as I can, Jeremy Bowen, who used to be a very fine, upstanding, you know, straight-on reporter, seems to have gone completely over to the other side, because he reported, did he not, that an Israeli bomb had hit a hospital, killing 500 people, when in fact not only was there no bomb, there was no 500 dead, a missile had misfired from Islamic Jihad into a car park, not the hospital. And worse than that, when he actually was quizzed about it later, he said he didn't regret getting it wrong.
Yeah.
And he didn't apologise for getting it wrong. And the effect of that report that was put out very quickly and speedily before they could check it was that there were people burning flags in Tehran, you know, people demonstrating in Egypt, people demonstrating in Tunisia about this horror that the Israelis had carried out. And I don't understand how the BBC can allow it to happen. But we also know that there was a report written about the BBC a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
It's been asked for several times. The BBC won't release it. It was a report into anti-Semitism at the BBC.
That's right.
But they say they won't release it because they needed to keep the confidentiality of journalists.
This is nonsense. I mean, so this is not a new... This is, you know, the BBC's anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism is not a new thing. This has been going on for decades, and it's been brushed under the carpet. You're absolutely right. So it was about, I think it was 2003.
Yeah.
Having received numerous complaints about their bias, decided to commission a report.
Yeah.
And they hired one of their journalists, a guy called Malcolm Balin. He listened to hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage, and he wrote this, I think, 20,000-word report. This report has never, ever seen the light of day. There was a challenge, a Freedom of Information challenge. The BBC spent almost £500,000 worth of licence fee payers' money to defend this thing and stop this thing seeing the light of day. Now, the BBC have had so many scandals in recent years, you know, Jimmy Savile, Martin Bashir.
I started running through them. I didn't even get to Hugh Edwards before I'd filled an entire page.
But they keep saying how they want to be transparent. Well, why aren't you transparent with this? Why are you brushing it under the carpet and hiding it? We have anti-Semitism in the UK now higher than at any level ever in the history of this country, probably since 1290.
And don't forget, it was only this week in front of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport Committee that Tim Davie, the Director General, said he thought they were doing a pretty good job of impartiality.
They're doing an outrageously bad job. This thing, you know, just on transparency alone, there must be a public interest. Given anti-Semitism at the levels it's at the moment, there must be a public interest in releasing this report. Now, the fact is, this report is 20 years old. So you're protecting journalists that probably don't even work in the BBC anymore. And if they really do, we'll redact their names. But we want to see, what did the report say? What recommendations were made? And did the BBC follow those recommendations? Because I don't believe they did, or they can't be, because they are just churning out factual inaccuracies, demonising Israel the entire time. And here's another interesting thing. You know, I've been to Israel many times with politicians just to show them what it's like on the ground. And it's incredible. You know, the minute they arrive and they walk along the beachfront in Tel Aviv and they see Arabs and Jews friendly, playing football on the beach side by side, they sort of say, well, this wasn't what I was expecting.
Yeah.
You never see that on the BBC. No. And the same, when you see Gaza on the BBC, all you see, this is pre-war, you saw the place sort of totally decrepit and buildings and the place looking like a war zone. You never saw the luxury flats and the swimming pools and the lovely hotels. There was a lot of that. It was made out to be this sort of, this open prison. But, there are websites where you can actually see what really goes on. Yeah. You never see it on the BBC.
It's extraordinary. We could talk about this all night.